Welcome into episode 96 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
Security news is constant and constantly calling for comment. That's where we come in, hitting 5 security and privacy stories and, offering some takes from the guys at SecureMac. Items on the list today: quick look may lead to long looks. Apple code signing flaw could let everybody in. Security updates squish the black dot bug. Some freaky Facebook patents. And finally, La Liga is listening. So, quick look may lead to long looks. This is, we'll get through the story and then I'll get a few questions for you guys. Nearly a decade ago, Apple introduced a really cool feature that it turns out has been a point of vulnerability for nearly a decade. The Hacker News says the quick look feature in macOS is holding on to information for longer than it takes to take a quick look. For people who aren't familiar, Quick Look is the feature in macOS that lets users preview documents, photos, media, and folders without having to open the files or folders in question. It provides a preview or quick look. It does this by generating a thumbnail, which one assumes is being thrown away when you're done looking. Except it's not. According to the Hacker News, the cached thumbnails are stored on the computer's non-encrypted hard drive at a known and unprotected location, even if those files or folders belong to an encrypted container, eventually revealing some of the content stored on encrypted drives. Patrick Wardle, Chief Research Officer at Digita Security, says people have known about this for at least 8 years. However, the fact that behavior is still present in the latest version of macOS, and though potentially having serious privacy implications, is not widely known by Mac users, warrants additional discussion. And it works for all sorts of files: regular files, encrypted files, files on external hard drives, files held in password-protected, encrypted AFPS containers. This is potentially a big deal because, as Wardle explains, if an attacker or law enforcement has access to the running system, even if the password-protected encrypted containers are unmounted and thus their contents safe, this caching feature can reveal their contents. So let's talk first of all about how this happened. It feels like so much stuff. This is made for convenience, right? Apple wanted to provide a literal quick look at files. And so, the best way to do that is, okay, well, we'll just put this little postage stamp over here. And then anytime anybody wants to see it, there it is to see.
Yeah, the way the quick look cache works is very similar to how it works on a web page. Your browser will cache a version of the web page, the website, so when you click the back button, for example, it's not having to reload all that content over again. It just grabs from the cache and updates what it needs to. In this case, if you're trying to preview a very large image file, for example, sometimes it takes a couple seconds if you open it and preview for the actual image to load. Quick Look will save a thumbnail. It's a smaller version, a lower resolution version of that image. So when you push the spacebar to quick look the image, it pops up almost immediately. So it's totally for convenience. And the way that works with computers is the cache file thing. And then the reason that it's storing cache files of all these different documents that you've quick looked previewed before is so that in the future, when you go to quick look it again, it's not having to recreate a new thumbnail. It's doing it again for another layer of convenience.
Right. It's even quicker. You want quick look to be quick. Heck, it's right there in the name.
So at what point does it actually delete those quick looks? Or do you have to manually delete the quick look cache files located on the system?
That's the thing with macOS. Some cache files and locations are cleared on a semi-regular basis because it's a Unix-based operating system. It's just the way the OS will work. Some aren't. I actually dove into my own quick look thumbnails a while ago, and this was just not related to this particular, well, I guess could be related to this particular issue, but there was stuff going back quite a ways, and it was really interesting because you don't necessarily think about that, especially from a security perspective. I think, from my own experience as a developer, I understood the way cache files work. I understood that there was a thumbnail cache being generated. I didn't really think about the fact that it was also doing that for encrypted volumes. That definitely is an oversight, in my opinion, on Apple's part.
That was incredibly surprising to learn, because you would think that security would mean security and encryption would mean encryption. And if I need a password to open a file, then I really should need a password to even check the file, it seems.
Well, or if you have to have a password to open up the encrypted container. So if you have a disk image or an external drive or anything like that that has an encrypted volume, and you mount the volume by entering a password, then you'd have access to all the files within without having to re-enter a password. And it's also quick looking, creating thumbnails of those too. Now, the way that would work with the cache file database, it would store the path to those files. So from a developer point of view, yes, Apple could be checking, does this path for the file equate to a volume that was encrypted when it was mounted, when it was loaded onto the computer? If so, let's delete this. But no, it's not the case.
But if you're like the security and privacy conscious type folks, going into this cache file, like seeing all these, let's say you have encrypted disk images and you have your confidential documents, returns, all that stuff on external hard drive, are these being cached locally on the computer, where if somebody were to get a hold of your computer or even that database and say, okay, we need to try to find this hard drive, or now look at this disk image, or, while they're trying to scavenge all your data and files for all the confidential information. I mean, it's kind of like a treasure map drawn out for folks, yeah?
Yeah, and I mean, you also, from a security perspective, if you were privacy conscious, yes, you could go in and delete that cache of thumbnails yourself manually. But then you'd be losing all of the completely valid thumbnails for, pictures of your cat or whatever, something that's not containing your social security number, your bank account information or whatever. That's kind of the annoying part is for your, typical user who might be concerned about privacy, there was no real middle ground there. Keep my private stuff private, but also give me the convenience of fast loading previews for everything else.
I want to ask the question, actually, who has to worry about this and in what circumstances? I mean, I am right in thinking that somebody would have to have control of your Mac to actually exploit this, right? I don't want to call it an exploit, although I guess it is a vulnerability. Somebody would have to have...
It's an oversight.
Right. But
is what it is, yeah.
But it is an oversight that could, lead to a bunch of information. Like going back to what Mr. Abba said a moment ago, I haven't tried this, but I do have I have a tax return. My most recent tax return is stored on my Mac. And it is actually password protected. But if I go to Quick Look, because here's the thing with my scripts for Mac OS Ken, oftentimes I'm like, which show did I mention that in? And so I'll type in something. Like, let's say I'll type in, I don't know, the name of a company. Let's say I type in Microsoft. Every time that Microsoft has come up in one of my scripts, it's going to be there. But then I can actually go into Quick Look. I can pinch to zoom a lot of times and read the whole article, even in that little, maybe not pinch to zoom, maybe it's drag it out. But either way, I can read my whole script just in Quick Look. So, it's not just about, this is pretty accessible, I guess is what I'm saying. But somebody would have to have my Mac to actually take advantage, right?
Well, yes and no. If somebody gained remote access into your computer, knowing where the Quick Look database file is on the computer could then start going into that, looking at the data contained within there.
They still have control of your computer in that sense. So either physical or remote access with malware or what have you.
All right, so scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I'm fine, 10 being I'm just going to burn this whole thing and then put it in a shredder and then put it in a hydraulic press. How worried do I need to be about this?
Middle of the road, a 5, I'd say. I guess it kind of depends on if Apple's going to address it.
How could they address it? Let's give Apple the game plan. How could they fix it?
Well, as far as the article went, Patrick Wardle actually came up with some pretty good suggestions, which would be either not generating any sort of preview if the document or file was on an encrypted container.
That's good.
Or what I mentioned a minute ago is just delete the cache file when that volume's unmounted. The way it works for creating a thumbnail still has the file path. So in the background, Apple could say, could do a check and say, hey, is this volume that this file's on encrypted? If so, get rid of it when it's unmounted. So there are definitely some concrete steps Apple could take. As far as, your normal files that are on your computer, that's more up to you. If you've got unencrypted files that have your, really personal information in it, and there's other security concerns there besides Quick Look.
See, there's an issue now that makes me think I've been talking to you guys for too long, honestly. So let's say there's a file on my computer and I've password protected it, right? So if I go in and search for that, search for whatever it is that's going to lead me to that file, is it then going to show me something with a lock on it, or is it going to show me nothing? Because if it shows me something with a lock on it, then if I'm a bad guy and I'm trying to find out if you've been stealing information from somebody else, or I'm a law enforcement agent who's, trying to find out more information about you, then we go into the whole metadata thing. We go into the whole contour drawing. Like, I can't see what's in that file, but I can see that he has the term nuclear secrets in there, right? Because even though I can't read it, I can read that there's something there that may say something about nuclear secrets. And so, you're still... It's not the same vulnerability at that point, because somebody who shouldn't have access can't read it, but they can now see that there's something that they can't have access to.
That one's kind of a chicken and the egg. It depends. Was this a password protected file before or after the metadata was generated? But yeah, you've probably been doing the show with us for a little, almost 100 episodes if you're thinking about those scenarios.
Along a similar line, see, the last story is going to make it sound like I kind of know what I'm talking about. This one, I am dumbing down, partly because I want other people to understand it, and partly because I want to make sure I understand it too. This could be a bad case of they're with me. There was an issue with code signing for the Mac that for years, according to the site Naked Security, made it possible to make malicious code designed to run on OS X and macOS computers full security tools into thinking it had been digitally signed by Apple. Now, I'm not a developer, and this is stuff that was apparently confusing some developers, so stick with me. Let's start with the definition of code signing, which Naked Security says, code signing is a security construct that uses public key infrastructure to digitally sign compiled code or even scripting languages to ensure a trusted origin and to ensure that the deployed code has not been modified. On macOS and iOS, code signing focuses on the Mach-O binary and application bundles to ensure only trusted code is executed in memory. Okay, I don't understand most of this, but after reading it a few times, I think this is how this would sort of work at the most basic level, like you're explaining it to a 5-year-old. The problem comes in when Apple would look at a particular guy, okay, and this would be the Mach-O binary, and see that that was good, then assume that everything else was good and sign off on all of it as good. So put into different terms, if you're getting on a plane and you have a ticket, you have to present ID, you have to go through a metal detector, right? Now, if you're getting on a plane with 10 people, all 10 of you have to present tickets, all 10 of you have to present IDs, and all 10 of you have to go through a metal detector. Now, if we make this code signing vulnerability the TSA, it would basically have checked the ID for the first person in the group, put the first person through the metal detector, then assumed that the other 9 were fine because the first one checked out. So they get to skip the ID, they get to skip the metal detector, and who knows what they're taking on the plane. From a technical standpoint, I know that's an oversimplification, but help me out. Does that actually sort of illustrate what was going on?
Yeah, that's actually pretty close.
Okay. Except that I know, with the Mach-O thing, I know that everything had to happen in a certain order. There were like 4 steps actually, and they had to come in a certain order. The Mach-O, I think, was the first one. The Mach-O binary vulnerability thing was the first one. And then if 3 other things happened, then everything just kind of got in. So I guess the first question I have, is this fixed?
Kind of. Apple doesn't actually see it as a security flaw. They're saying it's the developer's problem. And the issue there stems from some kind of incomplete documentation on Apple's part, and they said they'd update the documentation to make it more clear what this particular system call is doing when developers are using it to see if something is signed properly. Basically, the way the actual stuff works for developers to check if something is properly code signed by Apple is to call basically a system call in their code, and they have to supply the correct flags to it. That's what they're called for the programming terminology. And if you supply the correct flags, if you supply different flags, it'll do different things. So it's kind of like you are giving it options. I want to know, is this signed? And if so, is it signed this particular way? And if you didn't do it correctly, you'd get back a message saying everything was fine, and it wouldn't necessarily be. So it was basically if you weren't checking, if you weren't looking at it close enough, if you weren't giving the correct flags to really do the in-depth check. And the particular vulnerability was, again, as you mentioned, it had a lot of specific requirements on the part of the bad guys trying to sneak the code in. And basically with when we were transitioning from PPC to i86 architecture for the Mac, for PPC to Intel, Apple had a transitionary period where the platform could run both older types of PPC code and newer types of code in what's called a universal or FAT binary. And now, and so that would kind of combine different versions of the same application or same file compatible with different computer architectures. And it would look like one file to all the users. You could distribute it to all your users, and no matter what platform they were on, it would run. And so in this case, it was, you had to have, the first part of it had to be valid, and then the rest of it had to be malicious. So it's one of those things where, yes, if there were enough steps taken in a very specific set of circumstances, that it could happen, but it didn't necessarily. I guess it's hard to say that this was necessarily a really big security flaw versus a bit of everything. A bit of a security issue, a bit of poor documentation on Apple's part, a bit of developers not understanding that documentation, and it all kind of combined to, hey, there's this thing that you can do to make it look like this is signed by Apple.
The thing that confuses me about that, though, is you're saying it's poor documentation on Apple's part. It's a poor understanding on the developer's part. It seems to me, and, I trust Apple. I believe that Apple is working, for my security. It seems to me that if Apple comes across something where it's not doing all of the checks that it should, for Apple to say, well, that's on the developer because it should have checked, they're still potentially letting bad stuff into the App Store. I mean, it almost sounds like everybody at this point is just pointing fingers rather than saying, how do we fix this? Because if I'm a developer, I mean, and just for my time is money, I'm going to be looking for the quickest way to get something into the App Store.
Yeah. The thing is, and Apple's not alone in this, providing not stellar documentation. Sometimes they have really great documentation. Sometimes it's not so great. Half the time their example code doesn't even work. And worse, sometimes they take it off the website and the references disappear, but it's just, they'll create some example code for some new API, and then a couple years down the line, it's no longer working. They didn't bother correcting things. You also have the problem, as I said before, with developers not understanding documentation. Developing is hard enough as it is, even without poor documentation. But you'll have somebody who will think they figure something out, and they'll post it on Stack Overflow or another website that's helping programmers out. And then you have a bunch of other programmers that go, oh, hey, this guy says this works. I'm just going to copy and paste this code. It looks like it works to me. We're good to go. And that happens all the time in the development world. And the problem is, if that initial person posted code that was incorrect, either out of ignorance or malicious intent, you have all these other developers who then have introduced the same vulnerability in their programs because they took a shortcut. They didn't understand the documentation. They're like, hey, did somebody else figure this out before me? I'm just going to piggyback off their work. And that happens all the time. All the time. So in that case, it really is a case of pointing fingers and passing the blame around, but nobody's innocent in that case.
So at this point, is there worry for the general consumer? And I sort of asked along the same lines. The Naked Security article pointed out that as far as anybody knows, this flaw wasn't exploited. I mean, is there any way to actually know? And then I won't ask you to do the scale of 1 to 10 thing again, but is this a worry for the general consumer, or is this good for us to know going forward?
I think definitely good to know going forward, but I mean, with that, it's something that's being talked about, so people will put this into play if they could figure out a way to take advantage of it for their own evil, malicious purposes, you know?
Right. Okay. So the good guys know now that they need to do all these things so that they're more trusted. And until this gate's closed, the bad guys know that there's possibly a way to sneak in.
Well, here's the thing. For the most part, the majority of developers will not even be checking the code signing validity. They'll only be checking maybe for their own program. They'll say, hey, was my program tampered with? And that's if they're following best practices, and not everybody does that. The cases where you'd be scanning somebody else's files and looking at the validity of a code for other files would mainly be found with security programs that are checking other programs to see if they're on the up and up. So because the security vendors are disproportionately affected by this, they're also very aware of this issue now, and they're all doing the correct checks, or they should be. So it's gonna affect certain segments of the developer world more than others, and those that are affected should hopefully be on top of it after the story broke.
Catching up on a few updates because, Apple issued a few updates. I thought it was in June, but I guess it was like the next to the last day of May. But in the last month or so, Apple has issued some updates that we want to tell you about. The Mac security blog for Intego says, in the first part of June, Apple released macOS High Sierra 10.13.5, security update 2018-003 for Sierra, and the same thing for El Capitan. That site says, between the 3 OS versions, a combined 32 security-related issues were addressed. Of these, 29 applied to High Sierra, 6 applied to Sierra, and 6 applied to El Capitan, with most of them shared across multiple OS versions. Interestingly, one of the issues fixed for the Mac was squishing the black dot bug. The Mac Observer covered this one back in May, referring to it as a new malicious text message making the rounds that can crash your Messages app. According to that report, Black Dot got its name from the black dot character victims saw, but the real payload was a ridiculously long string of invisible Unicode characters that came along with the message. The character string was so long it essentially choked the phone's processor. Once the victim viewed the Messages app locked up and stayed that way even after force quitting or rebooting the phone. Now, what's weird is nobody seems to have heard anything about Black Dot affecting the Mac, and yet the fix is in for all 3 macOS updates. Apparently, Apple saw fit to patch this across all OS versions just to be safe, according to Intego. Also released early last month, Safari 11.1.1. This is included in the High Sierra update. It addressed a combined 13 security issues, fixing everything from potential address bar spoofing to preventing denial of service or arbitrary code execution. iOS 11.4 addressed 35 security issues, including 10 for WebKit, 3 for Siri, 3 for kernel, and a bunch of others. watchOS 4.3.1 addressed 20 security-related issues, and tvOS 11.4 addressed 24. It's worth noting 20-something here, 20-something there makes everything sound incredibly insecure, except that a lot of these fixes are fixing the same thing or similar things across all the different operating systems. I feel like with all of the updates that came out, this would be a good time to go over guidelines for updating software. And I want to start with one that always vexes me. How long do you wait on various things like macOS, iOS, watchOS, tvOS? I'll go ahead and update immediately, because if something happens with tvOS, as far as I know, I'm not storing any information on it. And the worst thing that might happen is I might not be able to watch the stuff I want to watch for, a few days while they re-update tvOS. But on the other ones, they feel a bit bigger. Like, well, let's just go down the list. How long do you guys wait before you update macOS on your primary machine? Not a test machine, but a primary machine.
I've got automatic updates turned on my Mac at this point. When it's a brand new version of the operating system, that upgrade, I'll give it a little bit of time. Like if it's a 0.0 version of something. But if we're just talking about patches and updates, for the Mac, I'm comfortable at this point leaving automatic updates turned on, just for the I guess the knowledge that if something did happen and my Mac wouldn't boot up or whatever, I could just, technically I could pop out the hard drive or hook it up in target disk mode, something to basically boot into that drive and get my files if I needed to. With iOS and to a lesser extent watchOS, I'm not as quick to update just because some of the updates in the past year have been really bad in brick devices in that,
Wait, did you do the beta update so you could do the walkie-talkie feature in watchOS?
No, I haven't.
One of the folks who ended up with a bricked watch?
Exactly. I have not done the beta updates for my phone or watch, I guess, for a number of years now, because a few years back, this is like probably 4 years back, I got bitten by one of the bugs where I was running a beta version of iOS and Apple didn't release an update, or they didn't release a code signing certificate expired or something, and all of a sudden the beta would no longer work on the phone, and I was traveling at the time. And I think it was only like a 1 day thing where I basically had no communications, and that sucked. It wouldn't have been such an issue if I'd been at home, but I have not risked that since then. Although I do have, I have my old phone that I suppose I could install a beta on, and I might at some point if I figure out where that phone went.
Yeah, it depends. I'll usually wait a few hours before an iOS update. And it's weird to think, well, a few hours wouldn't be enough, but generally speaking, a few hours is enough if it's going to be terrible. Like and I just happened to be lucky. I guess it was around the time that the iPhone 6 came out. I can't remember which version of iOS it was that came out with that, but I want to say there was like a carrier settings update or some like ridiculously tiny update that would have been something that would have applied to my phone. Generally speaking, I think literally it was, I just happened to be out walking my dog when the update became available. And that's the only reason I didn't end up with a bricked phone for 24 hours, because that update came out and did that. I gotta go back to what you said about the Mac OS though, really quickly. I believe you said, the worst thing that happens is I could open it in target disk mode, or I can't remember what the other thing you said was. Here's the thing. You're 301 or 401 level as far as dealing with a Macintosh. For the general consumer, do you suggest that everybody just, go ahead and turn on auto updates? Or would you say wait 24 hours, but don't wait more than 24 hours? Do you want to give it any time for people, I don't know, like my mom, like my cousin, like somebody who doesn't know, well, like me for that matter, who doesn't know about opening it in target disk mode?
From a security perspective, leave auto updates on because you're not going to, put off installing the update because it always pops up at the most inconvenient times. Hey, do you want to install this update now? No, just turn on the automatic updates. It'll download in the background. Install it overnight. That's the best way to do it from a security perspective. And Apple's track record with the Mac has been a lot better lately. Again, I would stress, however, that I'm not one to immediately install the brand new version of Mac OS the day it comes out, the hour it comes out, because those .0 releases, even though they've done beta testing for 3 months beforehand, public beta testing and developer testing, there's bugs and there's the edge cases and people lose access to files and all this other bad stuff. And there's usually a fairly quick turnaround before that first update comes out for it to patch a bug. I wait till that first bug fix comes out before I upgrade to a brand new version. So that's the way I would do it. I would leave automatic updates on just from a security perspective these days.
So in macOS, under your system preferences, under App Store, you have a whole bunch of checkboxes in there, automatically check for updates. And I have that automatically, or not automatically, but I have that selected there. And then underneath, there's a whole bunch of choices. So if you want to install the system data files and security updates, you want to at least stay on top of those automatically, you could just check that. Install Mac OS updates, maybe you'll just have that push notification or whatnot sitting on your screen until you're ready, or you follow your Twitter feed to make sure that they're not wiping everybody's wireless network settings or whatever the last big issue was with the Mac OS update, where people were getting messed up on their wireless settings. Isn't that what it was?
Yeah, something like that. I guess I should amend my previous statement. I keep the automatic updates on for the system stuff, for the stuff from Apple, the security patches and system updates. As far as third-party developer stuff goes, I like to be notified that updates are available, but I don't necessarily install those right away for the Mac App Store apps and stuff like that, because Apple, as I said, has had a pretty decent track record on the Mac lately as far as not causing too many problems with the security patches. Third-party developers, that's a mixed bag. Sometimes a third-party update's fine. Sometimes a third-party update breaks a bunch of stuff. So I'm a little more careful when it comes to my third-party apps.
So on your iPhone, when you have, your 3,000 apps on your iPhone, like I just picked up one of the iPhones that I have running beta software on, and I don't have it automatically do updates on there for third-party apps. But every time it seems, even after I update all the apps in there, like midday, there's at least 13 more updates happening. But do you actually go through and read the developer notes on each one to see what's included in there, or do you just update them all?
It depends. Some of them I just trust. Some developers don't even put any info in their updates. Like Facebook, have you ever looked at Facebook's updates?
I hate it.
We've made improvements to the app, and they don't list anything.
They don't even say that anymore. I think now it says something along the lines of we regularly update Facebook to whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell I haven't looked at it in a while because I never add anything
right.
helpful. And Apple can be kind of the same way. I mean, they give information on security updates. Like they'll do the page on their website saying what's in that most of the time. But Apple can also be pretty vague when it comes to what they're actually changing or fixing. And I think that kind of does a disservice to users. I feel pretty strongly that you should actually list what you're fixing when you do an update, because your users are trusting you to have made improvements.
Come on, but what if you're trying to do a sneaky update where you're, changing the user agreements and everything else within there, and
they'll send you an email
secretly listening through the microphone?
Don't worry your pretty little head about that, Mr. Rabba. It's fine. There's one other thing that we should mention here, only because we haven't mentioned it in quite a while. When you're updating, especially when you're updating to an entirely new operating system, but I mean, just as a best practice, backups. And if you want to know why that's important, may I suggest that you listen to episodes 1 through 65 of the checklist. Well, speaking of our friends at Facebook, man, have they got some freaky patents. The New York Times ran a piece recently covering 7 super patents obtained by the social network. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the layman's titles of all 7, because patents are a bit like end-user license agreements. There are many words. You don't always understand exactly what they mean. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to read the layman's titles of all 7 patents, and I'm going to ask you guys to pick out a couple that you want to dive into. Like, if each of you pick 1 or 2, that'd be great. Here are the 7 that the New York Times went through. Reading your relationships, classifying your personality, predicting your future, identifying your camera, listening to your environment, tracking your routine, and finally inferring your habits. None of that sounds creepy at all. I'm curious. Let's see, which way do we go first? Mr. Rabba, did you pick out 1 or 2?
Let's start with reading your relationships for 200, please.
What's wrong with that? No, okay, I'm sorry. This patent application discusses predicting whether you're in a romantic relationship using information such as how many times you visit another user's page, the number of people in your profile picture, and the percentage of your friends of a different gender. Now, this makes you uncomfortable. Is that correct, Mr. Rob?
Oh, it just opens a floodgate of ideas and everything else going on here. I mean, just having the idea here that Facebook is turning into the next dating site? Is that what's going on here?
Well, I don't know if it's a dating site thing or not. I mean, I guess I do wish, and maybe because I tried to read one of these patents. I tried to read one of the patents to see in plain English what it was that they might be able to do. And the thing is, you can't read a patent and see in plain English what somebody might be able to do. And I think, honestly, that might be part of the issue with all of these patents, right? You can read it and say, oh, well, there's nothing bad about this. Like there was one predicting your future, I think. I can read that one and see both good reasons and bad reasons, right? This patent application describes using your posts and messages in addition to your credit card transactions and location to predict when a major life event such as birth, death, or graduation is likely to occur. Okay. I might have. So
wait, they're tying in credit card data right there.
Okay, well, the patent says that they might be able to do that, right? But here's the thing: I can say, you know what? If I'm in a particularly bad way, and there's a chance that I'm going to do myself harm, somebody might be able to just look at the data and know that. And so you can say, okay, well, that's a great thing that they might be able to do that. Everything else that you're talking about is absolutely terrible there, right? That they're tying in with, credit card information. I mean, in particular, and using your location and using the messages that you've sent to other people. I mean, this could be everything from I'm planning to kill myself to I'm planning a surprise party to I'm planning to knock over a bank to I'm planning to get out of an abusive relationship. I mean, there are any number of reasons that you can say this is a wonderful thing for them to be able to predict, and this is a terrible thing for them to be able to predict, especially because once they can predict it, what do they do with that?
Exactly. And
then there's also the possibility that they're wrong.
And but how can you sell it to advertisers?
Well, there is that too. Mr. Tachek, did you have one picked out?
Yeah, well, I can't decide. I've got two, technically. The identifying your camera one was kind of struck me as a bit more than the normal tracking stuff that we're used to from Facebook.
It sounds completely innocuous when you say identifying your camera. My immediate thought was, Flickr's always done that, right? Uh-huh. Yeah, let me read the description and then you can go into, once I read the description, I don't think you'll need to explain why it freaks you out, but, let's just do it to do it. This patent considers analyzing pictures to create a unique camera signature using faulty pixels or lens scratches. That signature could be used to figure out that you know someone who uploads pictures taken on your device, even if you weren't previously connected, or it might be used to guess the affinity between you and a friend based on how frequently you use the same camera.
Yeah. Okay. So the way at first it kind of sounds like when you say unique camera, like, yeah, Flickr does that all the time. Web browsers do browser fingerprinting, and which actually Apple's trying to stop in the new version of macOS that's coming out this fall. But the way that works is it checks your operating system, your web browser version, screen resolution, battery percentage, some of that stuff depending on the platform. And advertisers will use that information to generate a profile, a fingerprint of your particular computer without having to rely on tracking cookies or something that could be cleared out by the user. And this is kind of similar, but kind of up a level, is when you're talking about faulty pixels or lens scratches, those aren't pieces of information that you could fake. They're not things that you could change unless you are getting your phone repaired or your camera repaired. Because faulty pixels are, that's something that's wrong with the actual camera. That the lens scratches are something physical damage that was caused to the camera. And I'm sure that the way it would work with Facebook is it doesn't have to be some humongous scratch on your camera lens that's totally visible to you. It might just be some small patch of a photo that's always going to be blurry or distorted because there's a tiny scratch on your camera and the phone software is not able to.
Wait, I thought that was a feature, that whole depth thing.
So it's that to me is kind of like, they're purported reasons for doing it. Okay, sure. They want to know if this camera is a household camera or something like that. It's still, that's taking tracking to another level. So that one was one of the ones that kind of was a little creepy. And I guess the other ones, it was like kind of a toss between tracking your routine and inferring your habits, because those are kind of the same thing, even if the patents are separate. Just in terms of what the companies that have all this data we're freely giving away are doing with it. They're not just looking at what we're posting or clicking. They get a bunch of other data, and when you start analyzing that data as a company, Facebook, for example, you start figuring out habits and personality traits and everything else based on inferred information, not necessarily something that you're providing directly to the company in the form of your posts. If they see that you're at one location every day from 5 p.m. to 7:30 in the morning, they could infer that that's your house. It's your home location. It's your apartment, even if you didn't provide that information to them. If they see that every weekday you're going to another specific location, they could infer that's where you work, even if you're not providing you're not filling out the workplace information on Facebook. And when you start kind of adding up all those locations and everything else, that can get a little creepy.
But Siri does this, so I mean, yeah, and why can't Facebook do it?
That is the other thing to note, is that Facebook is not alone with that. When you're asking Siri to kind of give you your, the distance or the time, expected time for your morning commute, or to remind you something when when you get home from work, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's because it's looking at your location.
Well, this comes back down to who do you trust, though? I mean, Apple.
Exactly. I trust. Yeah.
Apple has done a lot to say we're taking this information, but we're only taking this information and giving it back to you in a way that's identifiable to you. We're getting enough information to answer your question, but we're trying to separate, your identity from the information you're asking as much as we can on our end. Whereas Facebook has not done anything to show that they can be trusted with our information, except for apologize when they get caught doing something bad with our information.
Giving it away.
Yeah, exactly. Or selling it, or, whichever.
Selling it, sorry, yeah.
Some parting thoughts from the New York Times piece. Facebook has said repeatedly that its patent application should not be taken as indication of future product plans. Most of the technology outlined in these patents has not been included in any of our other products and never will be, said Alan Lowe, a Facebook vice president and deputy general counsel, and the company's head of intellectual property. But then conversely, the Times piece goes on to say, as long as Facebook keeps collecting personal information, we should be wary that it could be used for purposes more insidious than targeted advertising, including swaying elections or manipulating users' emotions, said Jennifer King, the director of consumer privacy at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. There could be real consequences, she said. The last item on today's list, honestly, it could have come from the list of fabulous Facebook patents, if you ask me. Checking in again with our friends from Naked Security. This is where we find the Spanish football league, La Liga, wanting to listen in on your phone when their games are on TV. The league is concerned about illegal broadcast of its matches, which it says cost the league over $170 million a year, translating, they say, into direct damage for clubs, operators, and fans, among others. So what they've asked fans to do is let the league's app access the microphone and GPS of a user's Android phone so that it can listen to hear whether a game is playing in a venue and then match that info up with whether the broadcast is legal or illegal. Now, they're doing a lot of things right, if you ask me. I mean, they're explicitly asking for information. They're only activating the functionality when the league games are being played. They're converting the audio into binary code so it would be recognizable digitally, though you couldn't listen back to it. They're anonymizing that data. They're asking users occasionally to reconfirm their consent, and they're making it possible to revoke consent at any time. And they are also upsetting a lot of people. According to Naked Security, 1-star reviews have been popping up in the Google Play Store, accusing the app of spying on users' locations with the intention of ratting out establishments that La Liga believes are broadcasting without a license. And then quoting a couple of reviews, you and your phone become their own personal spying device. Please rate this app 1 star before uninstalling. And don't we have enough controversies and dubious problems with big data? Now, I'm not an Android user and I'm not a football fan, European or American, so I have not seen the request for permission coming from La Liga. I'm curious, though, what you guys think of this story.
Well, are they actually saying what they're doing with the audio permission? Like,
yes.
we want to spy on you.
Well, no, they're not saying we want to spy on you. They're listening. See, this is the thing. I'm against it. I know it sounds like I was saying they're doing fine. I applaud them for being as upfront as they're being, and I still think it's kind of crap.
I agree with you. Actually, it's really refreshing to see a company or a league or whatever you want to call it here that's actually being honest with the users as far as why they're doing something that's otherwise pretty shady. That being said, I still think it's stupid, just because there are a few things immediately. Okay, well, if you really want to do the pirating thing and not get busted, turn the volume off on your TV at the bar or wherever you are. They wouldn't be able to tell then. Seriously, I mean, that fact that there's an immediate workaround there. I guess the other issue is, okay, they're losing $170 million a year to this. How much do they spend on developing this technology? How much bad press are they getting off of it? Could the money they spent on this whole setup be used to, I don't know, come up with a better solution that didn't involve necessarily spying on it? It reminded me a lot of something we're more familiar with, which is software piracy. Companies who have apps for sale frequently have to deal with piracy. We as a company have had to deal with it over the years, and you have to decide how much effort you're going to put into trying to stop the pirates from pirating your app. And at a certain point, you have to kind of say, does this outweigh time and money we could be spending on developing new features for our app and making our paying users happy? In this case, yes, the league is saying, oh, we're losing money by people who are pirating these broadcasts and playing them at a bar or wherever. And so they view it as that they're losing money and they want to be cracking down on that. That being said, fighting piracy in whatever form, digital piracy or apps or broadcast stuff like this, it's kind of a losing battle in the end. So I don't know how worth it is.
Yeah, piracy, I mean, bad across the board for everybody there. And it's, I don't know, it seems like a double-edged sword to me because just using the audio device to match up the data, I don't know if I'm on board with that. Like, I don't want people pirating our software, and I don't watch football myself either.
Right.
Go blue team.
Here's what I would say. Hire some guys. Hire some guys or hire some gals. I mean, ASCAP, BMI and ASCAP used to do this. I don't know if they still do or not.
I was going to bring that up.
Yeah. I mean, they used to go into a bar, and if music was playing, and it was actually, not just like some radio behind the bar that was there to entertain the employees, but it was not a jukebox. If they had put in a sound system and they were playing music for the enjoyment of their patrons, they would then say, hey, can I see your license for that? And I remember one particularly awful case in Boston, Somerville, I think it was, where this bar ended up closing because not only did they not have a license, but when ASCAP came around and said, well, we needed to make a deal, they basically showed them the door, and probably in not so pleasant a way. And the bar ended up closing down because they ended up owing tens of thousands, if not $100,000 to BMI or ASCAP. But here's the thing. They didn't make the patron of the bar the rat. They didn't make the patron of the bar the person who was snitching on somebody.
And so is this the next generation version of the ASCAP?
But they're making everybody
come in.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other weird thing is, okay, they're asking for the user permission beforehand. So you could just, I don't know if it would involve not being able to use the app if you don't agree to it, but you could just say no.
Right.
So, I mean, what incentive does a user have? I guess my question is, if a user's consenting to this, right, and they're at a place where they know it's not necessarily a licensed establishment, couldn't they just give a tip line? Hey, call us if you notice this place. It's the same thing in a way.
Yeah.
I would say, hey, spend the money on provide incentives to your paying league members. The ones who are legally and lawfully broadcasting your games. Figure out something that's not making a snitch out of your user, or it's a little backwards. But hey, at least they were asking permission. I mean, that is a plus these days.
Okay, so they're asking permission. How many of these other networks or anybody who broadcasts go, hey, maybe we should do something like that, or maybe they're doing something like that already? I mean, does this Is this one of those things where people are now going to start looking at them more closely? It's going to become the new normal?
I do wonder if La Liga feels good about the fact that they asked for permission, or if they're thinking, next time we're just going to ask for forgiveness. So a lot of the stories that we hit today, a layman wrote them, that person being me. But if you want to go deeper on any of these or all of these, there is a great place to do that. It is the website for this show. And that website is securemac.com/checklist. You'll find links to all the stories that we talked about today, and you will find ways to listen to every single episode we've done all the way back to episode 1, securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you'd like to ask or some topics you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. The address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. And we'll talk to you next week.